bipartisan group of Vermont lawmakers traveled to Israel amid mounting criticism of the country's offensive in Gaza. Plus, towns try a new model to tackle the overlapping issues of crime, addiction, and homelessness. And a massive solar farm in Shaftsbury wins approval. All that and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It's Friday, September 26th. And with us on the panel today, we have Lola Duffort from Vermont Public, Kevin McCallum from 7 Days, and Liam Elder-Connors from Vermont Public. Thank you all so much for being here. Well, the first topic that we're going to dive into today, not controversial at all, and of course, I'm making light of something I probably shouldn't, but look, we talk about tough stuff on this show sometimes, and nothing can be really tougher than the topic of Israel. And recently, some lawmakers, a bipartisan group, went to Israel. It was paid for by the Israeli government. 3 Democrats and 2 GOP members of the House. Lola Duffort, let me start with you. What was the purpose of this visit?
Well, it depends on who you ask, right? Because the Israeli government will say that the purpose of this trip was to demonstrate just how strong America's commitment is to Israel, right? It was this big show of support for the Israeli state at this moment when it is increasingly isolated within the international community because of its conduct in the Gaza war. If you ask the lawmakers from Vermont who attended this trip, they'll give you different reasons. Some of them are proud, unapologetic backers of Israel, would defend very strongly, how it is conducting itself in the war. Others called its actions genocide. And said that they went there because they wanted to see things for themselves, because they wanted to have the opportunity to leverage their concerns about what's going on in Gaza directly to Israeli officials. And, it's hard to know for sure why they went. Certainly, this came at a really important kind of inflection point, right, in how people talk about what is going on in Gaza. Their trip happened to coincide, most notably, with the UN's Human Rights Council declaring that what is going on in Gaza is a genocide.
Right. Now, what I find interesting about this is what you said about those who said, look, we wanted to find out ourselves what was going on here. But this is not the kind of trip where they were taken into the rubble of Gaza, where up to, I think, 50, 60,000 people have been killed by the Israeli military strikes. They weren't seeing that, were they?
No, they were not. They did not go to Gaza. They would say that, or at least one of them said, I know fully that this was a curated trip and that I was not going to get the full picture. But I thought that, I'm still going to be able to glean more information than just if I stayed at home, and I can come up with my own conclusions.
Okay. Kevin McCallum, they're back now, these legislators. What's been the reaction from their constituents for in a general sense?
I think the reaction's been overwhelmingly negative, that it was just a really bad look for them to go to Israel at this moment, and especially, as Lola said, to not go into any of the areas that are most hard hit. I think some of the concerns certainly was that at this moment to not actually try to get eyes on Gaza was just viewed by many constituents as not something they thought their lawmakers ought to be doing. And again, the word junket is not a pretty word. The word junket implies that you're going on a trip and having other people pay for your travel and your meals and your airfare and your hotels for a reason. To influence your opinions, to influence your ideas, to influence the policy that you might focus on in the future. And so I think a lot of people, when they realized the trip was sponsored exclusively by Israel, and then they didn't go to any of the controversial areas, they saw that as just foolish.
Now, Liam, we should point out too that these were not the only legislators in the country that were going on this trip. This was they called it 50 states, one Israel, right? So legislators from all over the country went on this.
That's right. So there was, I believe, at least one or two or multiple people from every single state in the United States going, and so the 5 Vermont legislators that went were just a part of that. But I think Kevin and Lola are making the points that are really strong, which is that this was a trip that was sponsored by the Israeli government and was very curated. And while lawmakers had access to some members of the Israeli government, is what they were saying, and were able to ask them questions and perhaps press them on some of these issues around Gaza and the genocide, that is not necessarily, it's still hard to understand, how, what kind of impact those questions made, like what the point of those things were. And, it's just coming at a very different time than a couple of months ago in terms of public opinion around what's happening in Gaza right now.
Yeah, and I don't know how many people were angry at them for not going into an active war zone. I think they were angry, those that were angry just because they went in the first place, right? Because no matter what they say their reasons were for going, the Israeli government, which sponsored this trip, that used it for a particular public relations perspective, right? Explicitly. We're like, this is the largest delegation of U.S. lawmakers to ever come, and we're having you come here at a time when the international community increasingly is condemning what we are doing, right? So however folks on the ground want to frame this, that's very different than how the Israeli government itself explicitly framed this.
Yeah.
And I think the lawmakers are having a little bit of a difficult time explaining themselves super well on this too, which is making it a little bit worse for them. I mean, Matt Byron came back from the trip and gave an interview wherein he basically questioned whether this was really a genocide because, the population numbers in Gaza are actually on the way up. So how could that possibly be a genocide? That made people, I think, wonder whether his view about Gaza and whether what was really happening there was being influenced by, the fact that he just got back from this trip. And then even the other day, two of the members from the trip came back and didn't seem to sort of really understand what part of the West Bank they had visited. Did you go to the West Bank? Oh yeah, we did. Oh no, we didn't. I'm not really sure. So then you also wonder kind of how educational the trip really was for them. It's a complicated area, of course. You can't learn everything in a 3-day trip, but you just got the sense that there was just not a deep understanding of the region that they got from it.
I just feel like, as Lola was pointing out, this is a time when the international community is very angry with the Israeli government. I mean, Netanyahu just gave a speech at the United Nations. People walked out during the speech. They're trying to make the case that this is all about Hamas. What Hamas did on October 7th, and I think it's important to say, was horrendous and it's indefensible. But the response is the disproportionate response of what has happened in Gaza is really making people take notice. And certainly Vermonters have taken notice of that. So it is a very hard sell, I would think, to come back to your constituents and say, well, we just wanted to learn what was happening when you're not even seeing the worst parts of what's going on there.
And speaking of international condemnation, et cetera, we're seeing European countries, including longstanding allies, recognize Palestinian statehood, which is being seen as this hugely important symbolic shift. We're seeing lawmakers that just went on a junket to Israel say, actually, this is a genocide. So we're seeing some really profound shifts in how people talk about Israel. My question is whether or not we're actually going to see material policy shifts, right? Because people can say one thing and then do another. It's harder to kind of gauge that in Vermont. It's not like state lawmakers vote on arms sales to Israel the way that Congress does. But to me, that's the big question, right? Is whether or not things like that are going to change. These lawmakers, or 4 of these 5 lawmakers, had previously sponsored legislation that was widely perceived as being very pro-Israel, would have explicitly tied the state's definition of anti-Semitism to criticism of Zionism. So
That bill did not advance. we should
a
be
bill
clear.
which did not advance. So I think to me the question is, what are we going to see in terms of legislating going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And we should point out, too, that Vermont's congressional delegation taking a very different tack here. They have been very explicit about condemning Israel for a lot of their recent actions, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, Bernie Sanders has been calling this a genocide for months now. And now,
he hasn't.
Sorry?
Sorry. It was, he called this a genocide last week, which was a really big deal, right? Like he has been criticizing the Israeli government for a long time and trying to block
the arms sales
to
certainly,
Israel.
yes.
Gotcha, thank
He's
you.
definitely been one of the most outspoken members of Congress on Israel. And I didn't mean to imply that
fine.
he hasn't been critical of Israel. But, again, he used genocide for the first time last week, as did the rest of the state's congressional delegation, which I think indicates, again, this shift in public opinion and in rhetoric, at least, within political circles.
All right, we're going to move on to another topic now that is, I guess, no less controversial in some ways, and that's immigration and detaining immigrants in Vermont. Now, Vermont has agreed to continue holding federal immigration detainees here, Liam Elder Connors. This is a renewed contract that came up, and it's been renewed.
That's right. So this is one that the state already had this contract with Immigrations and Custom Enforcement to hold detainees in Vermont prisons. And the new contract is basically the same as the old one. The state will get slightly more money per person that is held by, that is brought to them by ICE. And there's no expiration date for this, though either party can pull out of it. But what's interesting is that it got renewed at all. There was a lot of talk a couple of months ago that Governor Scott should cancel this contract, that he shouldn't renew it, from advocates and Democratic lawmakers. But Scott had been pretty steadfast that he would be renewing it because he thought it was better to keep people that were detained in Vermont. So the idea that they would stay here in Vermont prisons rather than be sent to another state and just sort of lose track of them. They would have better access to legal services and closer to their families here.
Pretty interesting and kind of nuanced here, because Lola, you were telling me before the show started that advocates for immigrants are actually saying, yes, we should renew this contract. What's their reasoning for that?
Well, they wanted detainees to be able to stay in Vermont, right, where they would have better access to them. What they didn't want is detainees sent to Louisiana or somewhere else where they wouldn't have that access to legal representation or their families, right, if they're here. And so, the view from advocates was pretty nuanced. I think they wanted maybe stronger protections for detainees in the contract. But, when lawmakers, Democratic lawmakers, sent out this call that we should just cancel the contract, it was not totally in tandem with what the advocacy community seemed to want.
Yeah. And I'll say that even though they're maybe more okay with the fact that ICE detainees can still be held in Vermont, that's by no means, advocates aren't saying that conditions in Vermont prisons are great. They still have concerns about people's access to legal services and access to translation services as well, which can obviously affect the detainees' ability to speak about a health condition or issues that they might be having in the prison. So there's definitely still some concerns, but definitely advocates would prefer people to be here in Vermont rather than shipped somewhere else.
There was a really fantastic story in 7 Days a little while ago, actually, about the wrong man being brought to, I think it was a detention hearing, because translation services are so poor.
I think we actually talked about that on this program,
actually.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, as Liam said, there are still some very active concerns in the advocacy community about what detainees are able to access here.
Liam, let me stick with you here, because Vermont towns, as we get a little more hyper-local here in this story, are trying this new model to tackle some overlapping issues dealing with criminal situations, something called the situation table, and you've been reporting on this. What is that exactly?
So essentially, it's a weekly meeting of social service providers, drug prevention treatment organizations, and law enforcement, where they look at individuals or families that are dealing with multiple overlapping issues, someone who maybe is struggling with mental illness and drug use and doesn't have adequate shelter. And they're looking at specific people and families and trying to figure out what services they need and how to connect them to those services. It's not a totally new idea, but the process that this situation table lays out is unique and different, and also struck me that many Vermont communities are trying this now, and the state has paid to train 8 municipalities across the state in using this model to try to address public concerns about open drug use and homelessness and general feelings that there's more crime and disorder are happening. So this is one way that law enforcement and social service agencies are trying to work together more to tackle these issues.
It sounds like it breaks down to communication. If you get more of these people that are all involved in this, there can be better communication about what to do in a next step situation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's communication, but the people that are currently using this model say there's also more accountability because they meet every week and people say, I'm going to connect with this person, have to come back the next week and say, I either connected with that individual or I didn't. And so there's a shared sense of responsibility and accountability that towns that use this are telling me is helping them out a lot. Interesting
too that they're willing to try something new because the problem isn't going away, obviously. And Kevin McCallum, there's a story that is sort of related, I think, to this. The former Woodside staff, and this was the juvenile detention facility, it went through so many problems. And Liam, of course, you reported on this too, so I want to get your take on this a little bit as well. But the staff engaged in a restorative process recently, but there was something about that was kind of missing. And tell us about what this process was.
That's for sure. So Woodside closed 5 years ago after a number of reports of significant abuse of the juveniles who were sent to the facility. And what you would kind of expect after something that sort of shocking and that sort of problematic would be for a restorative process to occur so that the victims of that abuse would be included and that some healing could begin and some feedback could be gained and some insight could be gained about what went wrong. And that's when I first started reporting this story, that's what I thought that they were doing, because they were talking about and sending memos around about needing to engage in a restorative process for Woodside. But sure enough, it did not involve the victims. It did not involve the victims' families of the abuse at all. It was merely a series of listening sessions for the staff and former staff of Woodside so that they could kind of air their grievances and concerns and frustrations about all the bad things that happened at Woodside and all the bad publicity about what happened at Woodside occurred. So they wanted to have, and they are having, listening sessions in order to sort of let staff vent about their feelings about Woodside, and because some people are very proud about the work they did at Woodside over the years. They did not see or engage in any abusive behavior of any children, and they're very upset with the state that the mismanagement of that facility was allowed to get as bad as it was. And so those sessions are underway, but a lot of the advocates for children say that's ridiculous. How could you possibly have a restorative process of any kind without involving the people who were harmed? And they're just calling it this, state staffers just having a kumbaya moment that's really inappropriate.
Do we know if anybody reached out to the victims to have them be part of this process?
No, they didn't want them to be part of the process, which is really strange because what you have to understand is DCF, Department of Children and Families, is really an organization that has gotten a lot of bad publicity over this, and there's a great deal of disagreement in and among the staff people who work there about whether in fact they did anything wrong and exactly what did go wrong. And they're in the process of trying to build and design a new facility somewhere in the state of Vermont. And so Chris Winters, the now former commissioner, right, said that part of the process here was to try to deal with our own stuff first, deal with our own internal divisions about how the state ought to have a secure juvenile facility before we go out and ask the victims and their families about how they feel about what happened.
Well, Vermont Public's Liam Elder Connors, actually, I remember when you broke this story about the horrific events that were happening to some of these kids at this facility, right? So I'm just curious, at the time you were reporting on this, were there staff members who were reaching out to you saying, hey, I wasn't involved in this, I'm getting a bad rap here?
I actually had some staff people reach out to me to say that they thought the reporting was exaggerating issues that they'd never had. They sort of took issue with the reports that I was writing about, which were regulatory reports that were issued by state employees who were charged with oversight of the facility. And so one of the big issues here at Woodside was that the state was overseeing itself, and you had regulators, state regulators, saying that there were really bad, horrific problems happening at Woodside, and then DCF saying, no, things are okay, we disagree with those regulatory reports. And so there was this clash happening there back in 2018, 2019, when some of these reports were getting issued. And so I think to Kevin's point, there's certainly some things that the state needs to figure out, especially when we're talking about building a new juvenile detention facility here in the state. But the fact that they're starting at this restorative point but haven't reached out to the families or the victims, I think is probably it's not a great look for them, given the intensity and of the problems that were at Woodside and people that were hurt at the facility.
And it's going to be fascinating just to follow this. Where are they going to put the next facility? Because right now there's a big NIMBY problem with that. Nobody seems to want another juvenile detention facility anywhere in the state at this point.
We've had 2 communities now say no thanks.
Yeah. Well, we'll be following your reporting on that one as well. I want to talk about a win here, if we can call it that. Kevin McCallum, a massive solar farm in Shaftsbury has won approval.
Well, whether that is a win depends tremendously on how close to it you live. So yes, the Public Utility Commission last week signed off on the largest solar farm in a long time in Vermont. The last one of this size was in 2017, I think. This one is going to be the size of 65 some odd football fields in Shaftsbury. Really so it's a big one, it's an industrial scale, and because it was so big, many of the neighbors in Shaftsbury said, we like renewable energy. We want state to be green, but we don't want that thing carpeting a beautiful hillside in our town. And so for a couple of years, regulators have been struggling with whether to approve something of this size, because not only is it near a bunch of a smattering of homes, let's say, it's a rural area for sure, but it's right along the highway, it's right along Route 7. So it's going to be visible from anyone heading north, particularly. And so they struggled with it. They're like, should we sign off on something this large that is going to be selling its power out of state? And the company that wants to develop it is a company from Connecticut. So there was this real struggle about whether to move forward with something this big. And then one of the commissioners in particular had some serious concerns about the project because it was going to be chopping down 35 acres of mature trees. Now, most of the project, I think it's 80-acre site, is on former pasture land. So that's a little bit less offensive to Vermonters, right? To put some solar panels on a former hayfield. But then to go 30 acres into, when you're building roads and to take out 30 acres of trees, just riles a lot of people, rubs them the wrong way. And it definitely rubbed one of the commissioners the wrong way. And she said, look, I'll sign off on this, but I'm going to kind of hold my nose on it. And I really think we ought to put projects of this scale in other areas of the state that do not require the removal of this many trees, which actually perform a carbon benefit to the atmosphere by removing carbon. So
interesting time for this to be happening too, because we know federal subsidies for solar are going to be ending fairly soon too. So the future of solar in Vermont is very much up in the air.
Absolutely.
Lola Duffort, I want to ask you quickly about school construction aid, because it's kind of in limbo. There's a lot of projects that folks would like to see happen, but they've got big price tags. What's going on there?
Yeah, I wrote a little bit ago. So the Central Vermont Career Center, which is the tech center that serves this region, is going to be going out for a $149 million bond during a special election this November. I think that's going to be the biggest bond we've seen since the Burlington High School. Wow. And it's going to be a tough sell. Meanwhile, there are a couple other communities considering going out for bonds, but very tentatively, because this is a really difficult thing to ask voters right now, and most school construction bonds fail at the ballot box. That's despite the fact that our schools are in atrocious shape. And that's not like a Vermont problem. It's not like we did a bad thing here. Well, we did. Most schools in America need a lot of work, but we also suspended school construction aid around the time of the Great Recession and never restored it. And so that has made it really hard for school districts to go out and bond on the projects that they should have been bonding and doing to keep their schools in better shape. And so the bill is now very much coming due. This is happening at the same time as officials are having this big conversation about school reform in Vermont. They're trying to redistrict the state. They're trying to come up with new maps. And as they kind of discuss this consolidation push, they have tried to continue putting the issue of school construction on hold. And so there's even like a tax penalty right now that can be triggered if you go out for a bond. And so, the state has put these measures in place that make it even harder for communities to do this work at the same time as the work is becoming even more urgent. And the added kind of irony here is that as the state kind of talks about redistricting, the big open question is how they're going to do any of this in a meaningful way without ponying up money to build new schools, right?
Because it's a conundrum.
Yes, because there are some places where you could close schools and send those kids other places without having to do a capital project. That low-hanging fruit does exist, right? However, in a lot of places it does not. So, and I'll eat my shoe if they actually find money.
Well, we'll see if they do. That's going to have to do it for this week. I want to thank our panel, Lola Duffort from Vermont Public, Kevin McCallum from 7 Days, and Leah Mulder-Connors from Vermont Public. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. Hope you'll join us next week for Vermont This Week. Thanks so much for watching.